and welcome back to V-Road, CCTCG's weekly Vanguard Podcast. I'm Cole.
And I'm Trey.
And today we've got a bit more of a chill one for the people who are just getting into the competitive side of the game, or who are a little bit invested in it already, but not too aware of how the set 4 meta has shaken up in Japan. So we're going to take a look at like a little deck standard pie chart and have more of a focused view to general discussion about how metas and sets can kind of pan out over time. The only key difference is that we don't have the Stride decks, the Hari and Night Rose ones, that they got a couple weeks after set 4 came out. We're not getting those until after set 5. So yeah, it'll really change how it looks for set 4. The chart that will show just the decks that came out in set 4 and all that will kind of pertain to the whole meta for us. Yeah,
it's kind of an interesting one because you'll kind of see it with this set, and it kind of resembles in most sets. So it's kind of like a little bit of a bell curve of the hype that new decks get when a set comes out, and then it kind of goes back down once people are starting to find out, okay, this one might not be as meta relevant, or this one's too slow in the current meta. There's a whole bunch of factors that come into some of these decks, and you start to see different little tweaks to, okay, this tech is better than this card, so on and so forth. So obviously there's always going to be those kind of staples that are just really good. Like currently Shoujo Doji is just the best deck in the game. Since it came out, it just has been phenomenal. And even though there's not any new cards that came out in this set for it, it's still just staying around. There are other cards that are like that and other decks that are like that too. But that's just kind of, one of those generic staples that's going to kind of always stay in the competitive scene, especially for team tournaments, being a big aspect of some of these results. So having those, variety cuts and, just almost kind of guaranteed wins, but not really, those staples that people are saying, hey, I can bring this and it's going to be competitive.
Yeah, you're going to see a lot of the same decks crop up in different places, and that's just how it goes with every card game, but especially in Vanguard, as Trey mentioned, with diversity cuts, it's going to always make a format look healthier than it might be otherwise, in that you're gonna see a lot of decks you might not expect to see at a top cut just because they're there and there might be only one or two of them. So that sheer small amount of them means that they're going to be picked over the more popular decks for the sake of showing a diversity, I guess, in the sake of a diversity cut. So getting into it, we've got our little pie chart, and the first week of this set, right here, you notice that there is a lot of variety from the top cuts, and there's a very large amount of decks being represented here, almost 10 as far as who's doing really well in the first week. And I think what stood out to me the most, and what I didn't really realize, especially when set 4 was coming out in English, is that Impuldio is just a really good deck right out of the gate. It's running a couple Brent Gate generic cards, and it can, but it doesn't have to, and it's raw mechanics keep it in the game, both from a competitive standpoint and in game to game.
Yeah, I mean, when it kind of has just a built-in defensive mechanism with its auto mods, it kind of just makes it so you can be a little more carefree in taking damage and stuff early, especially because you just get those little 5Ks. So it kind of dissuades early rush against the deck, which is pretty good. Not necessarily 100%, but just enough to be annoying and make your guards pretty easy so you can discard. But also you kind of want to take the damage. So it's, interesting deck, but very good out the gate.
Yeah, it's got a kind of a balance of I want to take damage early, and I want to take a lot of damage early in a way, because that can affect how much my power will scale later in the game. But to double up on that, the more damage I'm choosing to take early, and the more that damage is going to make me tankier, regardless of what that damage check is. And coupled with my divine skill, which is giving me 4 drive checks in a turn, and the grade 3 that can do drive checks on the rear guard, like the amount of drive checks you're doing, the more you like make sure you mulligan away all of your heals and stuff like that, it can really do dividends drive checking heals later in the game. It can like double or triple your survivability for the rest of the game, and there is like a huge gap with like a deck checking a heal and like going from 4 to 5 or 4 to 3, and Impuldio checking a heal and being like, okay, that's another auto mod gauge, you know, something my opponent can't really like influence much beyond. They still want to kill me, so I'm gonna have to get quite a few, at least 5, not to mention the amount I can make myself with my act and all that. So it's like it has this nice loop of keeping itself in the game long enough to ask your opponent for at least more than 4 perfect cards.
Yeah, it's a very, very good deck, and just kind of goes to show that some of these new decks, you know, might kind of sneak out on you and be surprisingly good, but then maintain that status. So as a good example of one of the decks that's coming from the set of like the main 6 decks that are, you know, kind of had the new rides, you know, not necessarily new ride lines in general, but, you know, new main boss unit. That's going to become potentially one of the new main staples in metas and going forward into set 5 and 6, so on and so forth.
Yeah, so I want you guys to like kind of pay attention to this pie chart as we go through the first 4 weeks of the Japanese meta for set 4, because you're gonna see Impuldio not really go away and somehow get bigger, but at least, you know, right next to that, as Trey mentioned earlier, is the man, Shojidoji. He's like the best deck in the format still. Right, in my opinion, I think he sits at the top right next to Varga and Shiranui. And I think the only difference between them really is that I think Shojidoji is a lot more complicated of a deck. It has a lot of game actions going along with it, but Varga is a really easy deck to play in a good way. It doesn't ask much of its player to see how its synergies work together, and that can make a tournament run a lot easier on your brain, if anything else.
Yeah, so I mean, you can obviously see that in this pie chart, there's the 3, you know, 4 or 5 kind of main staples that you'll see and should see, you know, throughout most of the tournaments coming forward. So obviously the 3 that were just mentioned, Shiranui, Shojidoji, and Varga. Those are kind of there. Leonorn, especially from this set, it's just gotten all the better with its new grade 2. You know, more consistency in finding that unison dress, so that's always good. And it's just a pretty generically good card. So uses some resources, but you know, you're not very resource intensive all that much in the deck, so that's going to make it stay. Blagmire also is just kind of one of those staples that is going to stay for a while, just because it gets good numbers, it has a lot of things, and it is very disruptive. And you know, if you can time your divine skill right and you catch somebody off and they don't have another persona right in hand, then you just destroy a whole turn of there. So it's just a very generically good deck. So the fact that it stays here in the top is you know, not really a surprise. But
yeah, especially with the triple rare it got, that just kind of helps it keep up even more with decks that might want to punish how much of a late game it can't have sometimes, and how much it might not be able to set up its soul to capitalize on its divine turn. So I think, you know, if you're looking at prices for this set and you see Vadrock Dragon and how much of a price tag it has, it's because it's arguably single-handedly keeping this deck in the spot it's in at like about like the 4th or 5th best deck in, as far as representation goes, at least.
Yeah, and then that brings in obviously another not new deck, but another deck that got some assistance, just like Blagmire did, Chris Rain. Chris Rain got a new grade 1 triple rare that specifically allowed it to get a 4th attack on your non-divine skill turn. So it was something that was necessary. I mean, it needed additional attacks, and it makes it so it's a little bit, well, better, obviously. I mean, having more attacks is always just a good thing. So, running a new triple rare that's a 4 of to keep it relevant, obviously, people were trying it out and it worked out for 4 of them, so that's pretty good. And then you got another new deck that got some good toppings in Lichafel, just because it also just has a pretty decent generic skill, and it's kind of a surprisingly tanky deck in the fact that it does draw a decent bit, and it's just a 18k base Vanguard after you divine skill, active on opponent's turns. So, just create some pretty good guarding numbers, I feel.
Yeah, it's kind of like a Majesty Lord Blaster, but not really that piece reliant. I think the one piece you want to find is the one that gives it a 4th attack on most turns, and that, I imagine, is probably not too hard to find with how much the deck seems to draw. So off of that, sort of kind of like Impaldio in a way, it can not so much like grind out other decks, but it can make the turns and where it needs to guard like crucial turns, like a Blankmire or like maybe a Varga trying to do its divine skill that turn. Like these pivotal turns of a game where you need to be able to guard efficiently, not only to live but also to have a meaningful like turn after that to pressure back against your opponent. It's more important than I think it's ever been in Vanguard to be able to be both offensive and defensive, and in a lot of ways all of these decks kind of embody that in one way or another. Obviously Impaldio with the automod gauges and how its set order works has Shojidoji just kind of being its new form, a copy paste of the old one, but giving it a defensive skill. Varga just being able to draw off of all the stuff it retires. Blankmire, I'm not sure how that deck like lives, honestly, sometimes, but I think it's one of those decks that draws just enough to get there. And then I think what's important about Chris Rain's new support is the fact that its restand is not grade 3 locked at all for the opponent. So it actually has a very, very meaningful turn 3 now, beyond just 15k in a crit, which is good, but it's not quite the same as what other decks are doing.
Yeah. So it kind of makes sense early on in the week 1 that you see all these different diverse kind of list, because you get people though who get excited about that one new card and they need to go try it out in a competitive stance. So it gives a good place where a lot of people are still kind of learning how decks kind of fit in and how they should run things, and they're still learning a little couple cards. Maybe they've got a bunch of playtesting in on it, but in playtesting sometimes things happen versus in actual tournaments where your opponent's specifically trying to outplay you, or in playtesting you're just running through the motions to kind of get into the habit of what a card does type thing. So very, very epitomized, like this is what a week 1 of a new set pretty much looks like. It's very, very diverse, very open.
Yeah, it's like very raw set 4, so going into week 2, we kind of see that, some things go away, but a lot of stuff is kind of staying the same. Like the 9 Impaldios that were doing good showings went up to 17. Like that's a big jump. That's almost double. Same thing with all the other decks, like Shojidoji almost like triples, Varga almost like doubles and then some, Blankmire also doubles and then some. And then we see that the 2 decks that kind of felt like they were on the verge but not quite enough to stay there for too long, being Lichafel and Chris Rain. When I say that like they're decks that draw just enough to live through pivotal turns, it means that over time they might be something that like a competitive player might be like, all right, I'm not going to play this too much beyond how it's performing the first couple times I'm playing it, because it doesn't seem to get there quite all the way like the rest of these decks do.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind is these are results from tournaments. So typically you're playing quite a few games in those tournaments. So sometimes it's just those decks that are like on that verge or on that cusp of being great, but are more just fun to play. Some people kind of put a little bit on the back burner just to kind of say, hey, I'm going to still own this deck. I'm still going to play this deck a lot. I'm going to play it, for fun. But when it comes to competitive and wanting to win, then they start to switch more towards, those common decks that are really good, like Leonard, like Blackmire, like Vargas, so on and so forth. So, it's just an interesting one to kind of see. Everyone gets those tests out kind of in week one, plays them a couple times, kind of see what it looks like, and then they kind of resolve back to that little bit of comfort.
I know people kind of maybe want to write off tournament results of like a locals. And there is some data from that kind of event here, but it is a mixture of like weekly tournaments that are ran all the time in Japan, like almost every other day, and regional tournaments that are happening during this format. So what Trey said about like, especially at regional tournaments, you're playing a lot of games in a row. So what you're going to find is that like decks that can not only do something both equally offensively and defensively, but they're also decks that, while maybe they're not easy, they're definitely asking a lot less of the like decision making part of your brain than other decks. So while I don't think Shojidoji or Shiranui actually is an easy deck to or like an extremely hard deck to pilot, it does take a lot more matchup knowledge than most other decks would. I see a lot of back and forth between like people like, okay, I have Shiranui and I have Varga. Which one do I take to this tournament? And you're like, okay, if you know all your matchups, Shiranui is the better pick. But if you don't want to think as much, and not in a bad way, you could just take Varga because it's just old, reliable. It gets the job done. And you know exactly how it's going to play against most decks, and it's not really going to care about what your opponent's doing.
Yeah, so it all just comes down to, really what the person's mental capacity is of who's playing the deck. I mean, if you have taken the time and you know every single combination and kind of how you can kind of go about getting any combo off you want in Shojidoji, then yeah, if that's what you are, if that's what you've committed your time to, you're gonna see people playing it because that's just how it is. People like the challenge of doing it over and over and over again and perfecting it. So you're gonna have those people who just keep that staple around, and it's other decks too. It's not just Shojidoji, but obviously it's got the biggest kind of reference to it right now, especially in current meta. So
yeah, obviously you're not gonna see other good decks on these pie charts. Notably, like, Rezael and Levi-Dros and decks like those that like are probably in like the top 10 of best decks in these in this format. But I think personally the main reason for that is in most competitive things, when it comes to picking something to use to win a tournament with, it's usually always the strongest and easiest things that will be showing up the most. And that can be both a like thing to notice and use yourself, or it can be a thing to like exploit. If you're seeing somebody who just plays Varga and they're not really like exploring other decks, there's a chance that they don't know the ins and outs of what other decks do. And you can sort of use that to your advantage and kind of catch them off guard with something maybe they couldn't have accounted for. And that's like a decision that you could make, especially if you're going to play a deck like Blankmire or Shojidoji. If they don't know what these decks do, or they don't know how to play around their main gimmick, especially with a deck like Blankmire and its divine skill, like if they don't know how to play around that, you don't auto win, but you get pretty close.
Yeah, catching people off is also part of the early bits of it, because not everyone gets to have the exact amount of play testing that they maybe would want to get in early on through proxies or anything like that. I mean, there's also plenty of programs out there to do play testing on specifically, but not everyone has the time to do that or the depth of knowledge to even want to try to build a deck and do things like that. They kind of want to wait to see tournament results, kind of want to see what other people at their locals are doing. It's different strokes for different folks in every sort of aspect of the game. So, you're gonna catch people off with things because they're not gonna expect some things. And each of us, like, I mean, Cole and I are a great example. Like, there are a lot of decks that we have that like are similar, but we have different pieces in them just because we cater to how we play one way or the other. So, I mean, you're gonna catch people off because someone might expect you to have something one way, and then you play it another way, and it's like, oh, I wasn't expecting that. So,
yeah, it's definitely when you talk about like, oh man, what did you just say? I completely forgot already. But you did say something pretty good about how people will have like different. I remember now. So when a set comes out, there are the people who will want to wait for term results, like you said. So the nice thing about pie charts like these is that those people will always have the resource to go into a new meta and not be blind ever. But the other important thing is that you should always keep in mind that when you look at stuff like this, the data is fairly accurate to what the strongest decks in a meta is. However, if you go to your locals and there isn't anybody who plays a Shoujo Doji or Blankmire, the way that you could construct your deck to combat these wouldn't really do much for you. It's very important that unless you are going to a regional or something larger than your locals, even if your locals is fairly large, if none of them are, or not enough people are playing some of these decks, the knowledge you could get from them can only be so limited, especially if you're playing a much more a niche deck. Like, let's say a Prison has always been a really good rogue deck ever since its support in set 2. So if you look at like how Prison lists are kind of adjusting to what other decks are doing, it might be good to follow their lead if your locals kind of mirrors what's going on here, at least to a notable degree.
Yeah, and everything is so dependent on to your use case of everything. Like, obviously, a lot of these results here are from major tournaments, local tournaments in Japan. So, it is what it is. If you have a 4-man shop who you get and play with every week, then, it's only going to depend on who or what you're playing at that time. Like, you can play around what they're playing. But you go to a shop that has 100 players and you're not really sure who you're going to be playing against, you kind of cater towards a more generic, or if okay, there's mostly people who play Shoujo Doji here, so you start to cater to how that deck plays. Like, there's so many individual use cases to everything with this game, and decks specifically. So, everything here, is a generalization of what good decks are, and you can kind of see that across the deck list and certain pieces that people are throwing in, and it makes sense. But also, it doesn't really matter if it's not how you want to play it. You don't have to play it that way.
Yep. So going into week 3, we kind of see that more. I like to think of like the third week of a meta is people kind of like figuring out either some new thing that's working or something that like started to work, but people haven't quite figured out all the way yet, are finally getting there. So that's how we see that a Leonorn just kind of drops off the face of the planet for some reason, and LCFL crops up. I don't exactly know what happened here that caused that, but there is always the thing of when a new format starts, it's going to take people a couple of weeks to get the cards they need and to play test enough to where they feel comfortable bringing a deck. So Leonorn is a good deck. There's no denying that. And the card it got in this set is really good. But the reason it could be showing up earlier in a format is because people might already have the deck. They might already see that it got a support card in this set, so they might have built up everything else for it sooner. So it's going to be a nice deck to have out the gate, along with other decks like Varga and Shoujo Doji, because those decks have been around for a while already. But then when you finally figure out like how Lisiafel works, you're gonna see it crop up to 12, in representation of this chart.
Yeah, I mean it's that cusp of knowledge is okay. You finally understand. Okay, this is how this plays, and this is how I should play it. This is how aggressive I should play it versus reserved. And once you kind of see that in this listing, as you can kind of see, okay, people figured it out. Now they know it's actually a good deck and are going to continue to run it, but kind of tweak it here and there to, still stay relevant and stay kind of fresh a little bit. So fun.
Yeah, I imagine there must have been some meaningful change in the lists of these to have such a big shift away from a deck like Leonorn. But I think what still surprises me, and in a good way, is like how Impuldio is like now tied for like the second biggest deck represented in this meta, and it says a couple things about like the quality of decks in Divines. How two of the newest ones in a set are also some of the best decks to be playing. There is sort of a thing in Japan and a lot of places and a lot of card games, if I'm being honest, called recency bias, where you're kind of, entranced with the new thing, the new deck, and you're really just kind of like latching onto that and playing that as much as you can. And that's not a bad thing, but I almost start to wonder, as like the numbers for Impuldio gets higher and higher, how much of that is the people who've been playing it since the deck first came out, or the people who are realizing it's very good and are just kind of latching onto it and helping boost its numbers.
Well, and Impuldio, and it's funny because these numbers kind of feel inflated, but it also kind of fits in that same kind of aspect of Varga. It's fairly, you can kind of turn your brain off and do it because you're just like, oh, I don't get punished for taking damage. I actually get rewarded for it. I get a bunch of cards to hand from drive checks. Like, it's fairly defensive in that aspect. So it kind of just exists and is pretty good. And it's 3 attacks, so you don't have to overly complicate your attack order or anything. Like, there's a lot that it can do, but also it doesn't do a whole lot. Like, it's a very interesting spot with it. So the fact that, it crops up in numbers actually makes sense because you get a lot of reward for it from not a lot of effort, I feel like. It's mostly just having the cards and doing it.
Yeah, it's very what you see is what you get. And it's also, if I remember correctly, very, very cheap. Like, at least in English, it was a very cheap deck to get together. And I can say that about a lot of decks in this set. But that can easily help explain why its numbers are as big as it is. And it's Japan. They like the anime almost like easily as much as we do, if not more. There are people who really like the character that plays it. I know a lot of people who play Varga play it because they like Now and stuff like that. So that can definitely contribute as well. There's a lot of things about this game that can make numbers like these. And I think that's like the cool thing about this game is that the anime has such a big influence on it that not other card games really have.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, there's like Yu-Gi-Oh! And other things like that, but Yu-Gi-Oh! Is now over, so now they're just kind of flying off the cuff. But yes, there's that recency bias is definitely huge, and the relatability to characters. Like, I got into playing Dragonic Overlord because I really liked Kai when I watched the anime initially. So there's something to be said about that. I'm still an Overlord player to this day, always will be, but I always build the new decks because they're still also really fun. So
yeah. So getting into the last week here, we got a big shakeup. So I believe this was when a lot of events were happening, a lot of big regionals and stuff were happening around this time. So that's why you're going to see all these numbers are a lot bigger. And I think we're going to get like more to form of what I think of when I think of this meta. Sans obviously how much of a representation Impuldio still has. Like, 22 or like top top spots over the course of 4 weeks is like a lot for a deck, it does so much to say how good a deck is out of the box, like from just a one set. And if you notice, it's the only set 4 deck that has lived through all 4 weeks being this well represented.
Yeah, so it kind of goes, again, that kind of, I say bell curve, it's not really, I guess, but best example of, okay, when a deck gets found out that it is going to be a staple, you'll see it be consistent. Like in this one, it's actually grown in favor. And obviously, Shoujo Doji and Blagmire and Varga and Leonord also have grown in that aspect, where some people may have been taking a break from it and playing other decks. But when it comes to the major tournaments, it's good to see that one of the recent sets is still in that dogfight. Like it's still there, kicking around and doing well. Because yes, it's great that you have some staples, and it's great that there's kind of old reliables, but you know, it's nice that a deck is still around and it doesn't go and say all 6 new decks that came out are going to be what is topping the tournament. Because if it gets to that point where you're not playing any of the old decks because they're not relevant at all, I think that's a bad spot for a game. So the fact that we do get a good mix of, like, Leonord is a very, very old deck. And yes, Shoujo Doji is a very, very old deck. It has a new form. Unison Dress is a newer form. But because of their support and, you know, things that got here, we have a pretty kind of diverse, like, okay, there's an older deck, some of the newer decks from set 1, set 2, set 3. Like, you kind of have a good one from each set and one older deck. So it's kind of just a good indicator that the game's in a very good spot, because everything's kind of getting support well enough to kind of keep it up there, as well as a new deck coming out of the box is pretty good enough to the point with enough generics that it's really good.
Yeah, and even when it comes to Empoleon, like I believe every list does run a healthy amount of generics, but it's no Resile Keter pile, or like it's no Brandgate pile in by any stretch of the imagination. It's running like 2 generic cards at most. So the quality of what it is compared to a set 13 deck from like original Overdress, you know, compared to a set 1 deck compared to a set 2 deck and a set 3 deck being Shoujo Doji, like, we've got one of everything here. We've got something from, like, I guess a legacy standpoint, I guess. At least in America, set 13 is about to be a year old. It's coming up. And, you know, yeah, right. And, you know, Varga's a set 1 deck that just has only gotten, like, banger triple rare after banger triple rare, up to, you know, Blangmire. That's just Blangmire is like the most comparable, I think, to Empoleon, how it was like right out the gate. It's really only gotten 1 card between now and then, and it's been solid enough to stick around by what it came with alone. So yeah, like Trey was saying, I think the format is very diverse. And while you're gonna see like pie charts like these that show you okay, these are the top 5 best decks, like full stop. And, you know, it sort of goes without saying at this point, but there is such a huge swath of, I guess we could call them rogue decks, or just like tier 1.5 decks, that can keep the format interesting enough for like a really long time if, you know, the release schedule of this game wasn't so fast.
Yeah, so we're in a good spot as a game, and it's very interesting. And obviously, pie graphs don't show the entire representation. Like, obviously, there are plenty of other decks that top, and again, a little bit of that just comes from diversity cut. But at the same time, there are enough good decks that you can get a lot of good wins against these top staple decks to still run other decks. But at the same time, these are going to probably be your more commonly seen at major tournaments and things. So
yeah, so I think with that, that'll wrap it up for us today. If you watched all the way to the end, thanks. If you like this kind of stuff, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep up with all the wacky stuff we upload, especially if you ring that bell to get notified on when that happens. So until the next one, I was Cole.
And I was Trey.
And we'll see you later.